In this interview, I'm going to be talking to Brian Scott, who's one of the founding members of PACE Alberta, and PACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. This is a really interesting, not unique to Alberta. It's been tried in Europe and the US for the better part of a decade, but it has plenty of potential in Canada for helping homeowners and commercial building owners retrofit their buildings to make them net zero or more energy efficient. So welcome to the interview, Brian.
Thank you very much, Markham. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, look, so am I, because, I've interviewed other folks about the challenge of retrofitting buildings in a cold country like Canada. Everyone recognizes that the existing approach to it is not the greatest, and while the federal government and some provincial governments and utilities have funding mechanisms, we're still going at a pretty slow pace. Pardon the pun. But PACE Alberta has a lot of potential. So maybe just let's start with an overview of what PACE is.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because I discovered PACE, about almost 10 years ago now. And at the time, I thought this would be a great solution. My clients were housing co-ops, and they wanted to make their buildings more energy efficient, but of course, affordability was always a factor. And we did a project actually in 1999 that was a high rise, and it was built to be the most energy efficient high rise in Canada. But we had to borrow 1.2 million to make that energy efficiency come true. And it was really hard to do. When I discovered PACE, I thought, oh, this is fantastic. And at the time, and I'll just say what it is, I mean, in its simplest form, PACE is simply a way of securing financing to implement energy efficiency or renewable energy measures. And it can be done for existing buildings, of course, as you mentioned, but it is also appropriate and suitable, and in fact, pretty important for new construction as well, because the building that's built today is going to be around for another 30 to 50 to 75 years. Might as well make it as energy efficient as possible from the get-go. That's the cheapest way to do it. So PACE is basically a way of securing financing. What's unique about it is that instead of it being the person or the company who's borrowing the money, effectively it's the building. And that's what sets PACE apart. It's actually a pretty disruptive technology when it's implemented right, because essentially in the case, the way it works is you approach an organization that provides PACE funding where it's enabled, and they do an assessment of your mortgage equity and your mortgage reliability, if you will, and they lend you the money based on the equity that you have in your building. And of course, other factors, but for the most part, it's the equity in the building. So that's the first thing that really sets it apart, which means that it addresses sort of financial equity or equality between different homeowners and such. So that's it in a nutshell.
Right. And it's important that for folks to understand that the loan is not paid back to the funder directly by the homeowner or the building owner. It's paid through property tax assessments.
That's right. And that's what makes it quite unique, because the security for the loan, as you say, is a lien on the property. And so the role that the municipality or the tax collection party plays is collecting the PACE payments, which in turn get passed on after they've taken a cut, if you will, to cover their own administrative costs, is passed on to the lender or the administrator, who in turn passed it on to the lender. The key thing about this part is two things. One, it ensures that in the event of a sale, that obligation passes on to the next owner, which is actually pretty key, because in a lot of cases, people are reluctant to make these implementation of measures because they think, oh, what if I don't recover that when I sell? And in this case, of course, it just automatically passes on. But the second thing, and I think it's important to note this, is that the amount of money that's required to really address the mounting or the growing crisis here is going to be on a scale that I think most people have not really gotten their heads around. I mean, for Canada, it's going to be over $1 trillion. And that's just really just touching the surface here. So the government's not going to be putting up $1 trillion. I mean, you know, they could, but the reality is they won't. So PACE and the security behind that mortgage lien, if you will, ensures that the private sector will be able to put that money up. And the reason they can do that is because they actually go to the global market. It's a longer explanation here. If you're interested, I can tell you more about it. But essentially, the way PACE is structured, that security ensures that there's basically unlimited capital availability for loans.
Right. And just as an example, we put in a heat pump in our house last year. And I haven't added up all the damage, but I would guess that it's somewhere around $16,000 to $18,000. Now, in British Columbia, we're fortunate to have, we had the federal program at $5,000. I think it's called Greener Homes.
Yep.
There's a provincial rebate. The BC Hydro had a rebate. So we had brought our costs down to something we could afford. But even that, I could see where a lot of families, and it would have been easier for us if we had access to PACE, but even after the rebates, sometimes the cost can be, it's a fair amount of money, and having a program like this would make it easier for families to make that decision to retrofit.
Absolutely, there's no question. I mean, essentially, the government's approach to date has been essentially, well, let's make it affordable by providing some kind of a subsidy, as you mentioned, grants and whatnot. PACE takes a completely different approach, which is essentially zero money down and repayment over a long enough period of time that the annual payments are affordable. And that basically goes to my point about ownership and equity, if you will, because there's a lot of folks, older folks especially, I think, they're house rich, but they're income poor, and they really couldn't afford to implement these measures. And often in living in older homes, they really need it. And PACE allows them to do it.
Right. What about on the commercial and business side? This seems to me to be ideal for that because absent really strict regulations or a very high cost imposed by something like a carbon tax, for a lot of business owners, it's going to be an accounting issue. We're going to spend X. What do we get back in energy savings? Y, and they make a decision. And I can foresee that maybe a lot of them would choose not to retrofit, but if they have access to a PACE option, that might change the calculation.
Not only might, Markham, it actually unequivocally does. With very rare exception, once a commercial operation, and that could be anything, a business, farm, etc., understands how the financing is structured, inevitably they make the decision to implement the measures, not just because it can be a good thing, but actually just because the bottom line is that it's more profitable for them. Let me tell you a really quick story. A number of years ago, a soccer club they were doing a new building, and it was going to cost $300 million. And they were doing some greenwash measures and whatnot. And one of the PACE administrators in the area got wind of this and met with the owners. And they were quite advanced in their design. And by the end of the meeting, there was a series of meetings, but by the end of the meeting, they had added another $25 million to their costs, only because every one of those dollars invested was going to pay for itself. So this was not a motivated client here. This was a client who simply wanted the building. They wanted a new soccer stadium. And then once they saw the economics of it, it just made sense. Just to give you a quick highlight here, in the commercial world in PACE, the most recent PACE loan, $89 million for one project. And that's purely economic. So on the commercial side, the motivation is economic.
Tell us about PACE Alberta, Brian.
PACE Alberta is a very small volunteer organization right at the moment. Was incorporated a number of years ago. Essentially, it was the culmination of my going on the road and doing presentations to a variety of different organizations and people. And eventually we got to a point where we thought, well, we should incorporate as a small co-op, if you will, so that we had a corporate structure. And we've basically been advocates for PACE in Alberta, but eventually it became more the rest of Canada as well. And as a result of our efforts, Alberta adopted PACE-like legislation. Essentially, it's PACE legislation. They just called it the Clean Energy Improvement Program. So PACE Alberta was essentially the source and the reason why we ended up with a PACE program in Alberta in the first place.
How long has it been around, and what kind of volume of investments are we talking about that have flowed through PACE?
You know, wait a second. Are you asking about Alberta? Are you asking about Canada? Are you asking about?
No, PACE Alberta. PACE Alberta.
Okay. Yeah. So PACE Alberta is just an advocacy organization. The original legislation was passed. You're testing me here. I think it was about 4 years ago now. And to date, I don't know if any money has flowed. It's taken a really, really long time. It took a couple of years before anything was actually put in place. And part of the reason was because the original administrators who were identified by the province was Energy Efficiency Alberta. And when the previous government were replaced by the current government, they dissolved that agency. So that was a fairly significant setback. They had to start back at square one. And part of it is because the approach that's been taken in Alberta, very similar to the rest of Canada, has been very much government involved or quasi-government organizations involved. And where it's most successful in the US, it has essentially been the private sector that has taken the lead. As for the amount of,
hang on a second, Brian, what other provinces have implemented a PACE-like program?
So Ontario has a program that dates back to about 2012, I believe, but really, really poor statistics. I think there's only been about 500 homes retrofit in the Ontario program to date. And Nova Scotia probably has the most, or I think it's Nova Scotia, has the most successful PACE program. But again, the funding for those programs are all coming from the government. And so as a result, they are very low uptake because they set a very high bar because it's public dollars. So, I mean, essentially, there's been PACE across Canada for a number of years. In fact, the Pembina Institute did a paper. They sponsored a paper on PACE before PACE was even developed in the US. I think it was back in 2004. And that paper sat on the shelf and collected dust. And in the US, when they finally came up with this idea, completely not even knowing that Canada had come up with this, it started back in 2009 in the US. And currently they're at $12 billion of PACE investments. So, you know, you can see the contrast between the two countries. And they've really figured out how to make it work because they've relied on the public sector, or sorry, the private sector, to essentially be the ball carrier in the case of bringing PACE to the public.
Well, Brian, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
You're very welcome, Markham. You have a great day.